A 13-year-old boy with an IQ of 141 reads his little sister a bedtime story, tucks her in, and kisses her goodnight. Their mother is working the night shift as a nurse, trusting her brilliant older son to babysit. Hours later, that same boy calls 911 in a panic, reporting that an intruder has broken in and killed his 4-year-old sister. Police arrive to find him covered in blood, crying, the perfect image of a traumatized victim. But within hours of investigation, detectives realize something is terribly wrong. The crime scene doesn't match his story. His behavior doesn't match his words. And when they dig deeper, they discover that this wasn't a random tragedy or even a moment of rage. This was a carefully planned, coldly calculated murder committed by a child genius who killed his baby sister for the most disturbing reason imaginable, to psychologically torture his mother. This is the case of Paris Bennett, and it challenges everything we think we know about childhood, intelligence, and the capacity for evil. Welcome back to Crime Scout, True Stories. The Paris Bennett case is one of the most chilling in modern criminal psychology because it involves a child perpetrator with adult-level intelligence and seemingly no conscience. Today we're examining how a gifted child became a calculated killer and what his case reveals about the intersection of intelligence, mental illness, and evil. Paris Lee Bennett was born in 1993 and from an early age showed signs of exceptional intelligence. By the time he was in elementary school, he was reading at a high school level, solving complex math problems, and demonstrating reasoning abilities far beyond his years. His IQ tested at 141, placing him in the highly gifted range. He was charming, articulate, and by all outward appearances, a normal, if exceptionally bright, child. His mother, Charity Lee, was a young single parent who'd had Paris when she was just 17. She worked hard to provide for him, eventually going to nursing school and building a career. When Paris was 9, Charity had another child, a daughter named Ella. Paris seemed to adore his little sister, playing with her, reading to her, being the protective older brother. But beneath the surface, Paris Bennett was nurturing dark fantasies. He later admitted that from a very young age, he'd been obsessed with violence, torture, and murder. He was fascinated by serial killers, studied their methods, and consumed media about the most notorious criminals in history. He was particularly interested in psychological manipulation and control. And he was intelligent enough to hide all of this completely. Nobody, not his mother, not teachers, not counselors, had any idea what was developing in his mind. On the night of February 4, 2007, Charity Lee left her 2 children at home while she worked a night shift at the hospital. Paris was 13, old enough to babysit his 4-year-old sister Ella. Charity trusted him completely. He was mature, responsible, and had babysat Ella many times before without incident. That night, Paris followed his normal routine. He made dinner for Ella, played with her, read her a bedtime story, and put her to bed around 8 o'clock. Then, he waited. What happened next, Paris would later explain in chilling detail during psychiatric evaluations and interviews. Around 10 o'clock, he went into Ella's room. He sexually assaulted his sleeping sister, then stabbed her 17 times with a knife from the kitchen. The attack was brutal, frenzied, designed to ensure she wouldn't survive. When it was over, Paris calmly cleaned himself up, changed his clothes, and called 911. His performance on that call was Oscar-worthy. He sounded panicked, terrified, reporting that someone had broken in and hurt his sister. He begged the operator to send help immediately. When police arrived, Paris met them at the door, covered in blood that he deliberately put back on himself to match his story, crying and shaking. He told officers he'd been in another room when he heard strange noises, went to check, and found an intruder attacking Ella. He said the intruder ran out when Paris screamed. The initial responding officers comforted him, believing him to be a traumatized witness and potential victim himself. But as investigators began processing the scene, inconsistencies emerged. There was no sign of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. The attack was concentrated entirely on Ella, with no defensive wounds suggesting she'd been awake or fighting back. The knife was from the family's kitchen, not brought by an intruder. And most tellingly, when investigators examined Paris more closely, his injuries, minor scratches he claimed came from the intruder, didn't match the pattern of defensive wounds. Within hours, detectives began suspecting that Paris himself was the killer. When questioned, Paris initially stuck to his intruder story. But detectives, experienced in interviewing suspects, began pointing out the impossibilities in his account. How did the intruder get in? Why wasn't anything taken? Why would an intruder specifically target a 4-year-old? Faced with the mounting logical problems in his story, and perhaps confident in his own intelligence, Paris made a decision. He confessed. But the confession was almost more disturbing than the crime itself. Paris admitted he'd killed Ella, but he showed no remorse. Instead, he explained his reasoning with chilling clarity. He said he'd done it to punish his mother. He wanted to cause her the maximum possible psychological pain, and he'd calculated that killing Ella, the daughter Charity loved more than anything, would achieve that goal. He explained that he'd researched the psychological effects of losing a child and determined it would destroy his mother emotionally. He'd planned the murder for weeks, waiting for the right opportunity when he'd be alone with Ella. Even more disturbing, Paris admitted to sexually assaulting Ella before killing her, not out of sexual desire, he claimed, but because he knew that detail would further traumatize his mother when she learned about it. Everything he did was calculated for maximum psychological damage to Charity Lee. He described his actions with the detachment of someone discussing a science project, not the murder of his baby sister. Psychiatric evaluations began immediately. Multiple experts examined Paris, and their findings were deeply troubling. Paris was diagnosed with psychopathy, a condition characterized by lack of empathy, shallow emotions, and manipulative behavior. But he wasn't legally insane. He knew exactly what he was doing, knew it was wrong, and did it anyway. His intelligence made him more dangerous, not less, because he could plan, manipulate, and conceal his true nature with exceptional skill. During evaluations, Paris discussed his fascination with serial killers, particularly those who'd evaded capture for years through intelligence and manipulation. He expressed admiration for their ability to control and dominate victims. Psychologists noted that Paris viewed other people, including his own sister, as objects to be used for his purposes rather than as human beings with inherent worth. One evaluator noted that Paris was one of the most dangerous individuals he'd ever assessed because his intelligence was paired with complete lack of conscience. Because Paris was 13 at the time of the murder, he couldn't be tried as an adult for capital murder in Texas. Instead, he was sentenced to the maximum possible for a juvenile, 40 years in a Texas Youth Commission facility, after which his case would be reviewed. He would be eligible for parole at age 58. The sentence was controversial. Victim advocates and some members of the public felt it was too lenient for such a brutal, calculated murder. Others argued that incarcerating a child for life was inhumane regardless of the crime. Charity Lee, the mother and ultimate victim of Paris's calculated cruelty, has since become an advocate for victims' rights and criminal justice reform. She's written a book about her experience and speaks publicly about the trauma of losing one child to murder and another to the criminal justice system. She's also been remarkably open about the complexity of her feelings, the love she still has for Paris as her son, combined with the horror of what he did and the knowledge that he did it specifically to hurt her. Paris, now in his 30s, has given several interviews from prison. In these conversations, he's articulate, intelligent, and superficially remorseful. But experts who've analyzed these interviews note that his expressions of regret seem performative rather than genuine. He understands intellectually what he should say and feel, and he's smart enough to mimic those emotions convincingly, but there's no evidence of true empathy or remorse. The Paris Bennett case raises profound questions about the nature of evil, the role of intelligence in criminal behavior, and the capacity for rehabilitation. Can someone who commits such a calculated, cruel act at age 13 ever be safely released into society? Is psychopathy in a child the same as in an adult? Should exceptional intelligence be considered an aggravating factor in sentencing because it indicates greater capacity for planning and manipulation? These questions have no easy answers. What we know for certain is that Paris Bennett represents a terrifying category of offender, the intelligent psychopath who understands human psychology well enough to weaponize it. His case reminds us that intelligence without empathy is not just neutral, it's potentially one of the most dangerous combinations possible. This has been Crime Scout, True Stories. Not all monsters are adults, and not all evil comes from ignorance or lack of understanding. Sometimes the most frightening criminals are the ones smart enough to know exactly what they're doing and cold enough not to care. Subscribe for more cases that challenge our assumptions about crime, criminals, and the nature of evil itself.